Normally, when loom knitting or knitting using needles or a machine, we start with the cuff or the hem and knit the ribbing and move upwards. Ribbing can also be added after completing the project, as I did for this sweater. My reason for choosing Afterthought ribbing this time is because this is how the sleeve was constructed. I worked it top down in halves so that I could decrease along the underarm seam rather than increase. The loom had enough pegs only to knit half of the sleeve at one time. So the sleeve is made in two pieces and the dotted line indicates a seam. After sewing this seam, I put the entire piece back on the loom and knitted the ribbing. Other reasons that you might choose to do Afterthought ribbing are that you simply weren't sure what sleeve finish you wanted, or you didn't know how long to make it and wanted to check the sleeve length so as to get a perfect length of ribbing. I'm going to show you two ways of making Afterthought ribbing. For either one, you will need either a crochet hook or a latch tool and your loom. If you wanted to do this using a single rake, here is the way that I would suggest. I'm going to knot one actual loop that does have a knot on it, so that will be my first stitch because I don't want it to grow. Here's my bind off. I'm going to work behind the bind off, pull the first stitch through towards myself, and I tend to leave a long tail. That one is the tail because it can be used for seaming, leaving me one less end to weave in. Now, working from what is the right side of the fabric for this project, push the crochet hook through and pull up a loop. I now have two loops. I could have hung the first one, but I think two at a time is pretty easy to do. Let's go behind the next bind off stitch, pull up a loop. Next bind off stitch, pull up a loop. Hang them on the loom in order. Don't worry that they tend to get bigger than you want the stitch to be, because after they're hung you can tighten them as I just did. There's my next bound off stitch. Under it, pull up a loop. This time I'll just pop them straight on pegs. It's best not to tighten too soon because it allows you just a little wiggle room to hang. Now these, I don't need the wiggle room anymore, so I can tighten them back up to whatever tension I would like the first row of ribbing stitches to be. Let's get that spare strand of yarn out of the way. Bound off stitch. I used a chain stitch bind off, so I'm going behind it, and the chain stitched one is very easy to see. I split the yarn there, and that's not desirable, so let me go back and correct it. There's a nice loop that is not split. Bound off stitch. When I say the chain stitches are very easy to see and discern, 1, 2, 3, 4, that's what I mean. And we just go behind each one in order. And using a single rake, and if I want knit one, purl one ribbing, which is what I usually want for cuffs. This is the sleeve of my sweater. After this is hung, I will just knit one, purl one across in the traditional way. If you like to start and end with a knit stitch, as some people do, for various reasons, ease of seaming is one of them, you can make sure that what you hang is an odd number. And if that requires an increase or a decrease, you can do this. I would usually use a decrease for a wrist. I can hang both of those loops on one peg if that will allow me to get an odd number where I would not have had one by the number of bound off stitches. Make sure you don't miss anything. In other words, I'm right at the end here. It would be easy to miss one bound off stitch, and that would leave me with the end of the project sort of flapping in the breeze. Not what we're after. Okay. This is a spare strand of yarn from the bind off, and now I would knit one, purl one, all the way across. In order for this technique to work well, you can see, having watched it be accomplished, that it's important to keep your bind off stitches loose enough that you can hang the loop formed behind each one of them on a single peg and still have room to move on to the next stitch. The pegs are a fixed distance apart, so each bound off stitch needs to be as large as the distance between the pegs from center to center. But for this particular project, I'm using a double knitting board, so let me show you that. The double knitting loom that I'm going to use was made for me by Cindywood. It's a special design. I'll put a link in the program notes so you can go to my website and see the details. This loom can have the pegs offset from one another by means of this extra pair of holes. I'm going to use the no-purl ribbing technique, which I've covered in other videos. That's also possible with pegs that oppose, but using it this way will make a snugger ribbing, which is what I want for the wrist. Here is the lower end of both sleeves. The one on the right has its ribbing already knitted. The one on the left is waiting to be hung on the board. The ribbing won't look its best straight off the board as you see it now. You need to give it a lengthwise pull to set the stitches. Here's the one that's already complete. I'm going to have the right side towards me, I'm over here, and feed the fabric up through between the layers of loom. There's just room for it. I have the boards spaced quite closely because I want my ribbing to be fairly tight. Here it comes. I worked this sleeve from top to bottom, and where I just ran my finger along, this is the bind off. Each of these chains represents one bound off stitch. So I'm going to work right behind the chains, just as I did to hang the sleeve on the ordinary loom. But I'm going to hang the sleeve on this double knitting board. Just as before, I knotted a loop into the yarn. So there's my first stitch. I'm going to pull my loop through just below the bind off of the first stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm centering the work on the board for easy management. So there is where my first stitch goes. Remember that the right side of the fabric is the one that you can see facing you as it comes out from between and under the loom, and work across, putting the hook behind or under is another way of thinking it, every chain stitch, and alternately placing the loop that is formed when you pull it through on a peg on one board and then a peg on the other board. You may need to work just a little bit loosely, making larger loops than you really want the stitches to be, so as to get the fabric distributed across the entire width of the number of pegs that you're using. Those loops are easily tightened up later before we knit the first row if necessary. We certainly don't want it sloppy, but we've got to make the entire trip. So make the loops whatever size they need to be to get you comfortably across the number of pegs you need to use, and then go back and tighten up if any of them are bigger than you want that first row of stitches to be. Make sure to work a loop beneath every single one of the bound-off stitches. When every bound-off stitch has a loop worked beneath it and that loop is on a peg, tighten up as needed by working with your hook across the row. And now we can begin to knit the ribbing, wrapping to and fro from peg to peg, front and back, as they alternate across the loom, will produce knit one, purl one ribbing. This is using the no-purl method, in which we form every stitch as an ordinary loom knitted stitch, but because the two rows of stitches oppose one another, if we call those on the front board knits, then those on the back board will be purls. I'm doing it with my fingertips just to show you, but naturally I've got to go get my loom tool to finish this ribbing. When the ribbing is as long as you want it to be, bind off each stitch in order. I prefer a chain stitch method using either a crochet hook or a latch tool because it produces this beautiful chain stitched edge. Do make sure, whatever method you use, that you bind off loosely enough that the wearer's hand can easily slip through the opening. Remember to give your ribbing a lengthwise pull to make the stitches assume their proper shape, and then seam the edges of the ribbing and then the sleeve together and you'll be finished.